Should felons be allowed to vote? Welcome back to this debated video. In this video, we'll be analyzing the arguments for and against prison voting rights. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Seriously, don't forget. These videos take around 15 hours to make and is very encouraging when we receive likes and subscribers. With that said, let's get started. So, here's a little background on felon voting rights and why it is an issue. In the 2016 elections, around 6.1 million Americans couldn't vote because of a felony conviction, which is 1 in every 40 adults. The most problematic part of this figure is that when looked through a racial breakdown, we can see that 1 in 13 African Americans were disenfranchised, which means the same thing as not being able to vote. So what we see is that disproportionate amount of African Americans are disenfranchised. Now, African Americans are more likely to go to prison, but not because of their race, but because of systematic racism. In New York City, 88% of police stops were Black and Hispanic people compared to 10% of white people, even though 70% were innocent. Furthermore, minorities are more likely to be convicted after being arrested and more likely to receive longer prison sentences when compared to white people who committed the same crime. Since a disproportionate amount of minorities are disenfranchised, the topic has become a huge issue. So, now that you have the background, let's see why people support felon voting. For reason 1, denying felons the right to vote is a form of systematic racism. Now, as we discussed in the background, systematic racism means that a disproportionate amount of African Americans go to prison. Once they go to prison, they're disenfranchised for all of their stay there and can be disenfranchised once they get out for years or their whole life. Now, you may think that this is the extent of the problem. But not only does disenfranchisement cause a lack of representation of minorities, it also increases the value of a vote from a white person. This is about to get very complex, so listen carefully. Prisons are typically located in predominantly white, rural areas, with rural areas hosting 20% of the US population but 40% of its prisoners. For example, take New York State. Even though 77% of its prisoners are African American or Hispanic, 98% of them are located in predominantly white areas. Now, this typically wouldn't be a problem, except when it comes to voting. The US has a 3-tier government: local, state, and federal. Just like on the national level, the state government has a Senate and a House of Representatives, also known as the Assembly. Members are elected by district, with each district getting 1 senator or representative because each district has a relatively equal population. However, the problem is that these districts are determined using Census Bureau data, which counts prisoners in the population of the district that they are being held in. So, for example, let's say that this was Area A. Let's say that the requirement to be a separate district is 10,000 people. Let's also say that Area A is rural and predominantly white, as are most rural areas. Now, let's say that the population of the people who live there is 10,000. Okay, so that means that the area is 1 district and gets 1 vote in the state Senate and House. But now let's say that in addition to the 10,000 people who are from there are also 10,000 people there held in prison. The area now has 2 districts and gets 2 votes in the state Senate and House. Now the area gets double the representation, even though there are only 10,000 people being represented in the House and Senate. Furthermore, since these areas are predominantly white, the vote of a white person is given more value than the vote of a minority. So, not only are we seeing a lack of representation for minorities because of systematic racism, we are also seeing that the value of the vote for a white person is higher than that of a minority. Moving on, let's also understand a bigger impact of the lack of felon representation in terms of who runs our country. What we talked about earlier affected our state legislatures, but lack of felon representation also skews national elections. Christopher Udgen, a professor of sociology at the University of Minnesota, estimates that felon disenfranchisement affected the turnout of 7 Senate races in the 2000 presidential elections. So what we see is that the disenfranchisement of felons has a significant effect on who runs our country. The fact that a presidential election could have different outcomes highlights just how severe the impact of felon disenfranchisement is. However, those on the negation of felon voting could argue that giving felons the right to vote would undermine our voting system on both a logistical and philosophical basis. Now, as we discussed earlier, most prisoners are held in white-majority rural areas. When we looked at this through an affirmation lens, we argued that this caused a lack of representation of minorities and increased the value of a vote from a white person. However, looking from a negation lens, we can see that giving felons the right to vote will cause a lack of representation of rural areas. Here's why. Let's go back to rural area A and say that felon voting is allowed. So now 10,000 people are residents and the other 10,000 are felons. Okay, so now Area A is classified as 2 districts and 2 representatives represent the 20,000 people of Area A. That is problematic. These 2 representatives were voted to represent Area A districts. Now, let's assume that the residents of Area A were majority Republicans and the felons were majority Democrats, which most felons are. Now, since these felons voted, let's say that 2 Democrats were chosen to represent Area A in the state Senate. But the felons aren't representative of the needs and beliefs of Area A residents. Those felons are there temporarily and are not part of those rural communities. So essentially, when felons are allowed to vote, it causes rural misrepresentation because the felons who voted for the state representative weren't exactly thinking about what the rural community needs. But those representatives are supposed to represent the rural communities. So when we looked at this through an affirmation lens, we saw that without felon voting, minorities were underrepresented. But with felon voting, rural communities are underrepresented because their needs and beliefs might not be represented in the state legislature. Moving on, the negation side still holds another reservation against felon voting. People who break the law shouldn't make the law. Now, this argument is exactly how it sounds. If you broke the law, then why should you have a say in how the law is made? Now, this argument in itself should theoretically only apply to people still in prison, not ex-felons. Ex-felons have already completed their punishment and are considered a functioning member of society, which means that they should not have their voting rights taken away from them. As for people still in prison, sure, it is true that if they broke the law, they shouldn't make the law, but the law is imperfect. As we discussed previously, systematic racism causes a disproportionate amount of African Americans to be in prison. Now, if systematic racism didn't exist, this argument would hold true. But since the law itself is discriminatory, felon voting should technically be allowed. Once we eliminate systematic racism in our society, then we should take felon voting rights away. Because at this point, disenfranchisement will be a direct consequence of breaking the law. But still, even with systematic racism, a majority of people in prison are there because they did something to break the law. So really, the debate comes down to 2 questions. Do we continue to allow minorities to be underrepresented and white people to have more voting power? Or should we allow felons to vote, causing a lack of representation for rural areas? And do we allow minorities to be underrepresented and systematic racism to prevail? Or do we let those who broke the law help create the law? This comes down to everyone's own personal belief. There's a trade-off for every answer we give. So, based on those questions, what do you think? Should felons be allowed to vote? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching this debated video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Seriously, don't forget. And we will see you next time.